Can you hear me? We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Just let everyone trickle in.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm sure there'll be more people joining us imminently. Just give it sort of a minute or so. All right, I think we can maybe get started and as more people join us. So hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to our ESG Bites webinar around Supplier Engagement 101, looking at how companies can accelerate decarbonisation through their value chain using supplier engagement as a tool. My name is Chloe Parkin. I'm an Associate Director within SLR's Environment and Climate Change team. And I co-lead on developing a lot of our net zero services within Europe. We're really excited to talk through the opportunities and challenges facing companies with supplier engagement on today's webinar. There's quite a bit to get through, so we're going to get straight into things. Firstly, just a couple of housekeeping points, if we can move to the next slide, please. So as you should have heard, all attendees are in listen-only mode, but if you do have any questions as we go through, please use the Q&A function and drop a question in there. We're aiming to leave some time for a couple of questions at the end. If we don't get to yours, we will try to get back to you directly, so don't be shy, please do drop us a question, we'd love to see them. Okay, if we move to the next slide, please. So just want to really briefly give a quick introduction to corporate citizenship for those who may not be familiar with us. So a couple of things. We have over 25 years of experience in sustainability and ESG consulting, helping companies to navigate the increasingly evolving space that we're in. We are also part of SLR Consulting. So SLR is a global environmental consultancy, and us being part of SLR now means we're in quite a unique position where we're able to offer our clients the sort of strategic advisory support which corporate citizenship has historically offered its customers, but then also with follow-on support with our broader team of technical on-the-ground implementation experts. So we have full end-to-end sustainability services right through from that strategic thinking to on-the-ground implementation. We are also a CDP accredited solutions provider, which covers our climate change and science-based target services, which goes some way to demonstrate the track record we have in this space, helping companies to measure, manage, set targets, and ultimately have a plan to achieve decarbonisation goals. Next slide, please. So on today's webinar, you have myself and my colleague David. I'll let David introduce himself properly when we get to his section so we can keep things moving along. And please do feel free to follow up with us with any questions you may have following the webinar. So if we move on to, so today's agenda, we're going to start off with a quick poll before we get into things. We'll then just recap why supplier engagement is a hot topic which should be on companies' radars if it is not already. We're then going to spend the bulk of today's webinar running through our 6-step approach to developing and implementing a supplier engagement strategy. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. So if we move on to launch the poll. So we'll give this about a minute for people to enter your responses. Okay, we've got majority of votes coming through so far. All right, the results are in. So this is just to get a sense of where our audience today is currently at on their supplier engagement journey. So it looks like the majority have set carbon targets, but haven't yet moved on to that stage of engaging with suppliers to achieve targets. Also got quite a few who are already engaging with suppliers on greenhouse gas emissions, and I imagine curious to learn a bit more. And some others who have not set targets or engaged suppliers yet. So great, hopefully we will be able to provide some relevant content to this spread of attendees today. So if we move to the next slide, thank you. So first of all, many of you will be aware of this given that you're on this webinar, but why is supplier engagement something which companies should be thinking about at the moment? So three sort of key drivers that we would raise today. Firstly, the scale of supply chain impact and the opportunity that comes with it. So there's an increasing awareness of the magnitude of companies' indirect impacts, which covers both upstream and downstream. This can apply to a variety of environmental topics, not only emissions, but also nature, water, waste. Today, we're going to be focusing on emissions, although many of the same principles will apply for looking at supplier engagement. For most companies, CDP has found that upstream supply chain impacts alone amount to 11.4 times their operational impacts. And with this growing awareness, stakeholders increasingly expect companies to address their broad value chain impacts rather than just those direct operational impacts as part of a credible ESG strategy. Secondly, as every IPCC report which is published reminds us, our global efforts towards decarbonisation are not moving fast enough, and we need to speed things up if we're to not exceed 1.5 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. The great opportunity of supply chain engagement is that collaboration is a really key lever to accelerate these efforts and multiply across more of the economy. And as organisations like the SBTI have emphasised, companies encouraging their value chain to work towards consistent targets and aligned goals helps to lower barriers to greenhouse gas reduction. Finally, there is growing multi-stakeholder pressure to take value chain accountability. So there's been enormous growth in voluntary initiatives such as Science-Based Targets Initiative, CDP, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, all of which encourage companies to measure, disclose and or reduce their value chain impacts. And additionally, there's growing regulatory pressure with legislation emerging from the UK, the US, the Security Exchange Commission and European governments such as Norway requiring companies to disclose and manage their value chain impacts. So this is really becoming part of what is expected of companies, and to deal with your value chain, supplier engagement is a key part of doing this. Can we move to the next slide, please? So on today's whistle-stop bite-size webinar, we are going to run through our 6-stage approach to developing and implementing a supplier engagement strategy. So firstly, we'll review the importance of setting clear goals that a supplier engagement strategy will support. Secondly, we will look at understanding a company's supply chain, so getting an overview of the supply chain impacts to ensure that any engagement activities are targeted and strategic. Thirdly, we'll look into the data collection part of a supplier engagement strategy. So a really important part of this is to gather supplier-specific data, and so we'll look at the different methods available to begin that process. Fourth, we'll look at going beyond measurement onto performance management, so ensuring that the intended outcomes for suppliers are achieved and measured. Fifth, develop a rollout plan. So bringing together all that work around data collection and performance, and ensuring that there's clear timelines for the different groups of your suppliers. And finally, we will look at integrating this into procurement systems. So making sure the strategy becomes embedded as business as usual. Next slide, please. So firstly, need to ensure that the company has clearly defined goals which a supplier engagement strategy will feed into. So for different companies, there may be a different environmental topic area. Again, today we're focusing on emissions. In order to develop a strategy, companies should assess their own footprint, so to make sure that they've got an overview of supply chain impacts, identify hotspots, and ensure that a strategy is targeted. Ideally, a company will have set a target which the supplier engagement initiatives will be supporting. So probably the most common of these that we see in the emissions space is some sort of science-based target, whether it's a Scope 3 reduction or supplier engagement target. However, companies might have others like renewable energy procurement targets or similar. The same principles will apply that we're going to run through. If we move on to the next slide, please. So point 2 of understanding your supply chain. The old maxim of what cannot be measured cannot be managed very much rings true with the supplier engagement process, and we would pick out 4 key steps in understanding your supply chain as a key foundation to this process. So firstly, begin with mapping a company's supply chain. So map suppliers across sectors and different service areas. You may also want to identify how many tier 1 suppliers are in the supply chain, and beyond that, what visibility there is of further suppliers in tier 2 and deeper. For many companies doing this for the first time, they may want to focus on tier 1 with a view to improving that granularity further down the line. In this presentation, we'll be operating at tier 1 for simplicity. Secondly, if this hasn't been done already, the company should look to do a footprint screening. So this would be an initial screening of impact across the supply chain. So for many companies, this would be an initial Scope 3 footprint. For that initial screening, many companies might use a high-level proxy measure to do this initial screening. So for example, spend-based calculations and data quality can be improved over time. As part of the initial screening, it's worth companies noting any data limitations or challenges which can be improved on going forwards. Third, we should look at establishing a baseline. So this baseline does not only refer to the emissions screening, which I've just mentioned, but actually getting an overview of where your suppliers are in terms of their decarbonisation journey. So this can be gathered either through desk-based research of published materials from suppliers, but to really get a bit more detail and start that engagement with suppliers, companies can issue a survey of different sorts to gather that data directly from suppliers. We'll look at the methods available for this in a moment. And thirdly, given all of this mapping work, this then finally enables companies to group and prioritise suppliers. So this would be categorising your suppliers into different groups for which different levels of engagement and ambition would be appropriate. We'll look at this in a moment. Some criteria you might consider include the proportion of supplier spend, proportion of emissions coming from those suppliers, criticality, so any critical suppliers who would be particularly difficult to replace, strength of supplier relationships, supplier ambition and maturity, as well as sector and geography. So on the next slide, we have an example of what this grouping process might look like. So a common first pass at identifying key suppliers to engage with will be an analysis of proportionally what share of emissions and or spend are allocated to each different supplier. It's worth noting that the prospect of Supplier engagement can at times seem a little daunting, but the good news is companies don't need to tackle their full supply chain all at once, which might include thousands of different suppliers in a complex structure. So as is shown in this example graph, which is a fairly typical spread of suppliers, this company has 1,000 suppliers, but actually the top 80% of its emissions come from just 50 of those. So that really helps narrow down that targeting engagement with those top 50 suppliers will have a greater impact than trying to address the full 1,000 all at once. It's worth noting as well, when companies try to determine the materiality of how many suppliers to engage with at once, of course, the SBTi has the requirement that companies should address over 67% of their Scope 3 emissions in the near term. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol also has a useful rule of thumb where if you're looking at that direct data collection stage, that it's a sensible threshold to try to get supplier-specific data from approximately the top 80% of emissions and/or spend. So that's what we've got in this diagram here. Next slide, please. So in addition to that initial measure of proportional emissions and/or spend, just want to highlight one other angle of looking at grouping suppliers. So as well as that proportionality, companies may also find it useful to consider climate maturity. When we say climate maturity, this might involve things such as suppliers who've already begun calculating their Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, the existence of climate targets or science-based targets that may already be in place, any existing decarbonisation strategy, and for suppliers of perhaps different size, sector, geography, and whether there is available personnel or resource for decarbonisation. Some suppliers might be identified as needing a bit of additional support. So by looking at these two angles together, you might be able to define sort of tiers of engagement. With this example we've got here, level 1 is the more mature suppliers and also those which have high proportionality of emissions. So it may make sense to have more early ambitious engagement criteria for those suppliers, whereas level 3 here may be appropriate to have a more phased approach. So phasing in requirements over time, giving a bit more time and support for suppliers to align with the decarbonisation strategy. Next slide, please. And so thirdly, and I'll be handing over to David in a minute, so once we've got the groups of suppliers, it's then time to start that engagement process. And one of the key first steps is to begin improving data collection. So when we think about Scope 3 emissions, we've provided a brief data hierarchy here of 4 levels of data accuracy, which companies will typically be aiming to move down the hierarchy to get that more accurate data over time. So an initial Scope 3 screening may rely on spend-based calculations, so emissions per dollar of spend in a company's supply chain. Additionally, for major products or services, a company may use generic product emission factors. Both of these are valid methods and incredibly useful to get an overview of supply chain emissions. However, the drawback of these is that because they are generic factors based on a broad economy, they won't reflect or capture the results of decarbonisation efforts from specific suppliers. So in order to achieve supply chain targets in the long term, it is essential to move towards getting that supplier-specific data. There's 2 types we highlight here. So firstly, getting supplier-specific corporate emissions data. So their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which can then be allocated to the reporting company. And secondly, aside from that corporate overview, getting product-specific emissions data. So this would be if a supplier is able to provide, for example, an LCA life cycle assessment of its product's emissions, that would greatly increase accuracy as well. Next slide, please. And just one final note on data collection. So this is just to highlight firstly that if a company is just beginning this process, it's very reasonable to expect that some suppliers may not have any corporate emissions data yet. So there may not be a scope 1 and 2 footprint or scope 3 footprint, let alone a product LCA, which would typically be available with more mature reporting companies. There are two main methods to highlight in terms of gathering that supplier-specific data. So firstly, companies may wish to choose an internal data collection system. So this could be something from really simple, cheap and easy to implement, such as a spreadsheet or even like an online form that you send to suppliers. Whilst this is cheap and easy to implement, disadvantage may be that data is then not particularly easy to analyse and maintain. Alternatively, companies may choose an internal software system or web-based application, which can be developed with bespoke data requests to suppliers. Those can then, the data inputs can then be automated and analysis becomes a little bit easier. One slight drawback to these bespoke systems could be considering whether it might add to suppliers' reporting burden by requiring bespoke inputs. The second main option is capturing data through an existing greenhouse gas reporting or disclosure program. So this may help reduce the reporting burden on suppliers if they can respond to multiple customer requests in a single platform. There may be incentives as well around gaining external recognition for good performance on those disclosure platforms. One potential limitation is that suppliers may have to pay to disclose on some of these platforms, and there may be less flexibility around bespoke data requests. So all these factors are likely to speak differently to different companies' requirements as to what's the most suitable method for their suppliers. Now I will hand to David to run us through the rest of the 6 steps.
Perfect, thank you, Chloe. Quick introduction to myself. So I'm David Bailey. I'm a managing consultant at Corporate Citizenship, and I specialise in our greenhouse gas accounting and net zero service lines. So moving on to step 4 of the process is performance management. So this is ultimately looking to communicate milestones and expectations on the suppliers. So you have a way of evaluating and managing their performance criteria. So this can be looking to put measures in place of what they need to achieve by what date to be able to align to your company's goals. Now, there's a number of ways that you can implement measures to enable these criteria on the suppliers. Some of these might be collaborative, some of these might be regulatory. So thinking about if a company needs to start calculating their scope 1 and 2 data, can you start provide skills in terms of upskilling on how to calculate those emissions in terms of a collaborative measure, or thinking more regulatory, are there kind of financial penalties that you can potentially put into your contracts with these suppliers to ensure that they are going to be moving in the direction that you need them to be moving in for your company to be able to be meeting your targets. And I just will note some inspiration credit on this matrix to the WBCSD, which has a paper on supplier engagement as well, but we've ultimately adapted this to kind of feed into our strategy. So moving on to the next slide, we can see how a company might then start thinking about putting this into a timeline. So ultimately, it can't be expected that all of these performance criteria are going to be able to be met by even the kind of the most developed companies necessarily in the first years. So thinking about how can you put lower requirements in kind of a near term, and then more stringent requirements into the long term, and phasing this across your different levels of suppliers as well. So those suppliers who are perhaps contributing a small amount to your footprint and aren't very advanced in their existing carbon footprints and kind of decarbonisation strategies, then they need significant or lesser requirements in the outset, and potentially in the long term as well, as than you would be expecting on those suppliers who are providing a larger proportion of your emissions, those suppliers who are already kind of climate leading in that scenario. So this will ensure that you're kind of phasing a strategy which gives enough time for suppliers to be able to adhere to your requirements, whilst also building in that that kind of ability for there to be time for them to get up to speed and enable you to meet your targets. Moving on to the next slide, we have then how this will kind of integrate into your procurement system. So ultimately, there's two different platforms that you're looking to engage to suppliers through. So that's your existing suppliers and that's your new supplier contracts. So your existing suppliers, ultimately, the key steps are to announce what your supplier engagement program is going to look like. This will ensure that all the suppliers understand the requirements and regulations that you're going to be putting on them, and gives them enough time to be able to adhere to your program, and also gives enough time for that engagement piece as well. So where there are suppliers who are kind of less mature in their greenhouse gas accounting journey, it gives a company, the reporting company, more time to be able to upskill that company if you're going through that upskilling route, or more time to put in place measures through that supplier engagement process to enable them to get up to where you require them in that timeline, so they can meet those goals. And then on the other side, it's thinking about new supplier contracts. So ultimately, you don't want to be putting out an RFP and having a new supplier coming in, and then they're not meeting the same requirements as your existing suppliers are when you've been through that engagement process already. So then it's starting to think about how can you set thresholds within your RFPs to make sure those new suppliers who are coming in are going to be meeting the same level of requirements you're expecting as your existing suppliers. So if you have some existing suppliers who are kind of in your level one because they're contributing a large portion of emissions, and then you're putting out a tender for a new company to come in, which might be a large tender over a couple of £1 million, and so you know that they're going to be purporting a large proportion of your emissions, then they should be adhering to the same criteria as you already have in that level one aspect for your existing suppliers. And ultimately, when you're kind of collecting these data for new suppliers, you can think about doing that through kind of your tendering process, any questionnaires out with the tenders, and for existing suppliers, you should be thinking about annual kind of data collection templates or surveys, or through those systems which Chloe just mentioned earlier. So those are our kind of key 6 steps that we're looking at to kind of go through that supplier engagement process. Hopefully that all kind of follows through and makes sense to everyone. And any questions, obviously, feed them through to myself or Chloe, or if your companies need any support in helping to develop these strategies and helping to engage with suppliers, then we're also able to offer those services as well. And then if we jump onto the next slide, we have just a quick announcement of our next webinar that we have. So if you jump to the next slide, please. I've got one more slide, sorry, on my one, which was that timeline, which ultimately is then what it's going to look like in terms of a full strategy. So thinking about those different aspects of data collection, existing suppliers, and new contracts, and how that phases out near term to long term for those different levels. So yeah, jumping onto that next slide. So we have the next ESG Bites webinar is on double materiality. So anyone who's interested in that will be exploring the synergies between enterprise risk management and double materiality, and how you can go about incorporating materiality assessment outputs into your risk management processes and vice versa. So that might be of interest to some people, and this is part of our ongoing series of ESG webinars. So we have a whole autumn series going ahead, which we've got in the next slide, which covers a whole range of topics, including scope 3 frameworks, avoided emissions, TCFD, internal carbon pricing. So hopefully these should be of interest. We might have time for one quick question. So I have one here which says, which emission categories should be used to determine supply chain emissions, and what is the most efficient way to collect data for a large supplier base in the thousands? Chloe, can I hand over to you to answer that one?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So in terms of emission categories to assess supplier-specific emissions, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance shows that that should be companies' Scope 1, 2 and selected upstream Scope 3 emissions. I can provide more context on that separately. And in terms of addressing thousands of different suppliers through supply chain engagement, I think, as we mentioned earlier, you don't have to tackle the full supply chain. You can target your efforts towards the most material. So focus on those that are linked with the highest amount of spend and or emissions. In terms of choosing an appropriate method for getting that supplier data across a large set of suppliers, it may be worth engaging with your suppliers to understand what reporting platforms they're already using to reduce the reporting burden. Be aware of any potential costs associated with responding to data requests as well through various platforms. Yeah, you can always pilot different systems with a priority area of suppliers and then iterate if you find that it does work or if there are limitations to that.
Perfect.
I think we better wrap up there. 1 minute over time. Apologies, everyone. Thanks again for joining, and hopefully this bite-sized webinar has provided some useful information. If you do have any follow-up questions or would like to discuss further, please do reach out to me and David. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.